Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're discussing this relatively new study that identifies a somewhat interesting way that some of the life on our planet evolves. And it involves the eccentricity of the planetary orbit. And Earth's eccentricity is known to change approximately every 100,000 years or so, meaning that it evolves from being relatively circular to being a little bit more oval in shape, or a little bit more eccentric. And this is one of the so-called Milankovitch cycles that also is known to affect the climate of our planet. But more recently, the scientists actually identified something really intriguing, something involving some of the most incredible organisms on our planet that are also extremely important in our oceans. The organisms that we usually refer to as the Coccolithophores, the organisms that also represent plankton and also represent one of the biggest sources of carbon dioxide on our planet, but also some of the most mysterious and also more weird-looking organisms that we've discovered to date. And so this new study seems to provide a lot of evidence for a very interesting type of evolution these organisms go through as our planet changes its eccentricity. In other words, it implies that the orbital changes of planet Earth also seem to evolve certain organisms, changing how they affect the planet in some other way, which in effect also changes how they then affect our planet. So all of this is kind of important. But let's start with what exactly these organisms are. Here's actually what a very stereotypical Coccolithophore looks like, and this one represents the most abundant and the most successful of this particular species. But what exactly are these organisms, and what are they actually made out of? Well, in essence, this is just a single cell organism. There's a cell inside of this shell, with the shell itself made out of calcium carbonate, or actually made out of different plates of calcium carbonate that then connect together, forming the actual shell. And so this entire species is defined by the presence of the calcium carbonate plates and the shell on the surface. But underneath the shell, you'll find a single cell that's sort of similar to a lot of other phytoplankton, or basically organisms that are able to produce oxygen and are able to photosynthesize by absorbing carbon dioxide and turning it into something else. And so these organisms are in essence plankton, but they're also phytoplankton, meaning that they do use light to produce oxygen and to fixate a lot of carbon dioxide. But because they're not plants, because they're not fungi or animals, they sort of belong to their own group known as Protista. A group that sort of encompasses a lot of different life that doesn't really meet requirements for being an animal, being a plant, or being a fungus, yet still having a relatively complex cell on the inside. And they also always live in the water. These are marine organisms, and they're also photosynthetic, which means that they exist in really large numbers in certain parts of the ocean where there is quite a lot of sunlight. And as you can see from this video right here, they also have quite a lot of diversity when it comes to shapes and sizes. And they're also extremely successful and are extremely widespread. This video from NASA, for example, demonstrates how the concentration of similar organisms changes in various oceans throughout the year. And because they're so widespread, and also because they form an important part of the food chain in the oceans and also produce a lot of oxygen, and on top of this fixate CO2, even though Coccolithophores are not as well known as some of the other marine animals or marine organisms, they're still some of the most, if not the most important organisms present in the oceans. And because of this, a lot of scientists always use them to study various effects on the planet and try to use them for a lot of other studies as well. For example, most of the modern studies involving some sort of a climate change will always involve these organisms for a very important and somewhat simple reason: their shell. Their shell contains a lot of carbonates of calcium, and it's sort of expected that as the CO2 levels increase on our planet and as the acidity of the ocean grows, this will most likely affect these organisms in some way or another. And that's what the scientists are trying to understand and are trying to study. And their influence and their numbers on the planet can actually be visualized with a very iconic place located in the United Kingdom that a lot of you might have already seen somewhere else. This area right here is known as the White Cliffs of Dover, and this is essentially also known as the chalk group. Basically, it's made out of chalk. And as you probably guessed by now, all of this, the entire structure here, was made out of these unusual organisms millions of years ago. This entire formation here is made out of tiny coccolithophores that existed for many millions of years. and all of this sediment eventually got exposed and produced these unusual but somewhat beautiful structures, with many very similar rocks existing across the planet and can easily be identified by studying them under a microscope. Because you'll basically see this if you look close enough, and these structures are relatively small, but they're still visible with a microscope. They're anywhere from about 5 to maybe 100 micrometers across. And the shell itself can easily get preserved for millions of years and maintain its shape as well. But whatever is inside is obviously long gone, and that's of course the cell itself, with the cell here containing the nucleus and of course all of the chlorophyll that's needed for the photosynthesis. But interestingly enough, even after years and years of study, nobody really knows for sure why these unusual organisms produce the shell. There are some ideas, but none of them are very specific. For example, the 3 most common explanations involve 3 different reasons. First, it can potentially accelerate photosynthesis by allowing certain types of carbonates to enter the cell much easier, while at the same time increasing the photosynthesis by diverting some of the light into specific locations around the cell. At the same time, because of the shell, some of the other light, for example UV light, might be prevented from entering the cell and thus damaging the cell. So this sort of plays a role in both protection and increasing photosynthesis. At the same time, it's basically a kind of an armor. And specifically here, it's believed that this protects the cell from being eaten by other bigger plankton, but also possibly from different types of viruses. And for different types of bacteria, viruses represent a pretty large problem. They can generally infect a lot of bacteria and a lot of different cells, and thus prevent a lot of them from being successful. And so by having a certain type of a calcium shell, this could maybe prevent certain viruses from attaching to the surface of the cell, and thus protect these organisms from being destroyed by a virus. But nobody really knows the true reason why these shells exist, especially since they do come in different shapes and different sizes. What we do know, however, is that these shells are one of the main reasons for the precipitation of calcium carbonates during the formation of the shells, and thus end up reducing the total alkalinity of water in the oceans, releasing a lot of CO2. And of course vice versa, and so they play an extremely important role in the CO2 cycle in the oceans. But the most recent study also identified how these organisms changed with the eccentricity of our planet. In this case, they've taken a look at approximately 9 million different individual coccoliths, representing approximately 2.8 million years of evolution, and used a very specific automated technique to study all of this. In the process, discovering that these organisms have 2 cycles, one that seems to be 100,000 years, and this would be similar to the eccentricity cycle of the planet, and one that seems to be 400,000 years, which could be a much longer Milankovitch cycle that we're still not familiar with. And in this case, depending on the stage of the cycle, the organisms go through a very specific size and shape changes. And so in general, what they discovered is that when the Earth's orbit is relatively circular, so not eccentric like it is today, the equatorial regions will obviously have a lot less seasonality. In other words, the equator is generally the same in temperature, and because of this there's a lot less diversity in coccoliths, with all of them being relatively similar in size and all of them possessing relatively general characteristics. But when the eccentricity starts to increase, that's when they start exhibiting a lot of specialization, a lot of changes in sizes, but also tend to actually not fixate as much carbon dioxide, and thus also produce a lot less limestone and a lot less sedimental deposits. And interestingly enough, a lot of this was not really correlated with the volume of ice or with the temperature of the planet. And this also suggests that a lot of the carbon variations that are seen in, for example, sediments could be directly related to the changes that are caused by these organisms. So the evolution of coccolithophores might have been influenced by the eccentricity of the planet, which then influences the temperature conditions on our planet because of the way that they interact and fixate CO2, and how they're then able to produce a lot of limestone deposits, which are basically carbon dioxide that's fixed in rock. And so this idea of eccentricity influencing seasons, seasons then influencing the evolution of organisms, and that in a sense influencing the global climate of planet Earth is actually a pretty interesting proposition. But as always, it requires a lot of analysis and a lot of further studies. And so I guess for now that's kind of all I wanted to mention, because there's really nothing else we know. It's a pretty exciting study, and these organisms are just too crazy not to talk about. But once we learn something else about coccolithophores, or how they evolve with time, or basically how they influence our planet, I'll make sure to follow this up with another video. Until then, thank you for watching. Maybe subscribe, maybe share this with someone who loves learning about biology, planet Earth, or science in general, and maybe support this channel on Patreon by joining the channel membership or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.